Okay, we're ready to go. Lot to cover, and so we'll cover as much ground as we can, and the rest, please know, on the website, on the Facebook page, and we'll give you homework assignments as we go. But I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to speak with you. That, as we've talked about before, this is as big as it gets. I mean, if we aren't excited right now, we really need to have our pulse checked, because this is just as big as it gets. So let's think about just some context, okay? 225 years ago, 55 men were putting the finishing touches on the most unprecedented work to keep a promise that was made years earlier by 6 of them and 50 others when they said, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to protect life, secure liberty, provide for the private right and control of property, and that with those unalienable rights that came from a Creator, we could be accountable for what we do with those blessings as we bless others' lives. And that was our unprecedented ideology of government. So we get to celebrate that 225 years on. That's our heritage. That's our heritage, and we have those same promises to keep now. And as the poet said, miles to go before we sleep. What a wonderful time. My goal is that you take from here the ability to teach at least 2 other people. That's homework assignment number 1. And you've got a little teaching aid with you, right? You've got your little teaching aid, and it's the map, and we're going to start with that map. And so your goal, or rather your homework assignment, is to teach at least 2 people as we go forward. So let's start. I learned as a teacher, I was a Japanese teacher, my wife's a teacher, I've taught religion classes and that you can't have more than 5 points. Better if you have it 3, I settled on 4. So we have 4 whys. To keep it simple, you can just, you hold up your fingers and, the little mnemonic aids, and you've got 4 things we're going to teach. The first one, we'll start with the 4 whys as we go. We start here, where socialized ownership of land is concerned. Only the USSR and China can claim company with the United States. And since 1981, when world-renowned economist John Kenneth Galbraith made that statement, the former Soviet Union has been liberalizing policies toward the private right and control of land. China has been liberalizing policies toward the private right and control of property. And we've been going the other way. We've been going toward greater and greater centralization when we were already in a league that in the land of the free and the home of the brave we never should have been in. But that's this whole concept of ideology. Unprecedented. Life, liberty, right and control of property, be accountable to our Creator for how we bless other people's lives, at competition with an ideology that is the centralized command and control of property and the means of production, and you have the liberty to do what I tell you can do. That's the competition that's going on. That's the revolution that's going on. Where will we stand? So there came a time when the Western states said, enough of that. We're fed up with this. And they got together and they started complaining to Congress unitedly. You're not disposing of the land like you promised. We can't tax the land to educate our children. We can't grow our economies and provide good paying jobs, and you're hoarding all of our abundant minerals and natural resources. Does this sound familiar? That was in 1828. 1828. And the Western states, by their own descriptions, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. Florida said, we're worse off than all the Western states. In fact, the Congressional Public Lands Committee, and there's so many of these things on the website, original documents, you can go back and read them all. But this is the Congressional Public Lands Committee of 1828. Look at what they say. If these lands are to be withheld from sale, which is the effect of the present system, in vain may the people of these states expect the advantages of well-settled neighborhoods so essential to the education of our youth. Those states will, for many generations without some change, be retarded in endeavors to increase their comfort and wealth, because they have not the power, incident to all sovereign states, of taxing the soil to pay for the benefits conferred upon the owners. When these states stipulated not to tax the lands until they were sold, they rested upon the implied engagement. Remember that word engagement. We're going to come back to that. They rested upon the implied engagement of Congress to cause them to be sold within a reasonable time. No just equivalence been given those states for a surrender of an attribute of sovereignty, so essential, so important to their welfare and to an equal standing with the original states. A remedy for such great evils. For once, I completely agree with Congress. The great evil may be found in simply carrying into effect the spirit of the federal Constitution, which knows of no inequality in the rights or powers of the several states. Missouri, and this is just representative of all those other western states of the 1830s and 40s, but Missouri says, look, the present condition of the western states, state of Missouri never could have been brought to consent not to tax the lands of the United States whilst unsold, and to not tax the lands sold until 5 years thereafter. They were setting the terms of what a reasonable time was. In many of the enabling acts it said 3 years. In other enabling acts it said expressly 5 years. That was the reasonable time they were talking about. If it had been understood by the contracting parties, sovereigns contracting to create a state, a uniquely sovereign act, that a system was to be pursued which would prevent 9/10 of those lands from ever becoming property of persons in whose hands they might be taxed. Illinois, 90% of their land was controlled by the federal government for decades. Missouri, 90% of their land was controlled by the federal government for decades. And yet, you look at them today, and Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Arkansas, 3 to 4% federally controlled lands. So here's your first why question, right? Why did they succeed? It's been done before. It's already been done before. We're not blazing new territory. We're simply learning the lessons of history so that we don't repeat the bad lessons of history and that we can succeed as they succeeded. Well, wouldn't it be important to know how did they succeed in securing the rights and blessings of their promise of statehood, which, by the way, as we'll see in just a little bit, is the same as the promise made to us at statehood? Well, they knew their history of their public lands. They knew their rights, and they banded together, and they refused to take no for an answer. In every significant interaction that they had with Congress, when are you going to keep our promise to our children? When are you going to keep your promise so that we can grow our economy? When are you going to keep your promise so that we have a true Republican form of government within the boundaries of our state? In every significant interaction that they had. Let's go back to the history, right? Knew their history, knew their rights, banded together, refused to take no for an answer. Well, we ought to know the history that they knew, right? Let's go back to 1763. And in 1763, in the colonial charters, the king, right? And the king creating these colonies said, here's the boundary of your colony. Here's Pennsylvania, here's New York, here's Virginia. And oh, by the way, to 7 of them, they said, you can claim, remember that word as well, you can claim the western wastelands out to the western sea. Now, even 7 of the claims, so 6 of them got no claims to western lands, 7 of them did, and even in the 7 that had claims to western lands, their claims overlapped. Fast forward to 1780. After those who pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, Robert Morris stepped up and personally funded the first 3 years of the Revolution, $2 million of his own money. He died penniless. Lives, fortunes, sacred honor. Now they're wondering what to do because Robert Morris is tapped out. We've got to continue to fund the revolution. We're in the middle of this revolution. And some of the states said, well, we need to raise taxes. We need to raise revenue. We need to tax our people. And the 7 that had the competing claims said, well, we'll just sell some of the western lands. Simple, no problem. And the 6 said, wait a minute there, partner. In case you didn't realize, we're all contributing our blood and treasure to this cause. And if you just sell the lands, we're going to have to tax our people. They'll flee our state and go to yours, and we're going to be left with no one. And if we win, you're going to claim these great big stretches of land, and we're going to be left with these landlocked areas of states. That's not fair. And in fact, we were almost to the point of a civil war in the midst of the revolution. They called it the Great Embarrassment that was happening. This was huge. Continental Congress stepped up and said, we have an idea. Transfer the lands to us. Cede the lands to us. We'll hold them in trust to create new states and use the proceeds to pay this debt of the war. And they came up with a resolution in September that just said, yeah, we'll hold the lands, we promise to do what we're supposed to do. In nice 1780 language, right? But the state said, that's not good enough. in something this important, you have to be very, very precise, very specific. Think about why. It makes sense. We're fighting a war against a land baron. Right? The king, the property law of 2-year-olds. If it's mine, it's mine. If it's yours, it's mine. If I can see it, it's mine. If I've ever been there, it's mine. If it's connected to mine, it's mine. And he had these forests, they called them. It didn't necessarily mean trees. It was just this land that he had preserved. And in the forest, it's mine. All the animals in the forest, mine. All the water flowing through the forest, mine. Sound familiar? Right? That's what they were dealing with. And they said, we're not going there again. We're not going to open the door a crack to have a land baron here, a centralized land baron. No, no, no. We're going away from that. And so Congress stepped up, and they came back and got much more specific, and they drafted this land ordinance of 1780 to solve that problem. Let's hold the land in trust, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, and create new states. The unappropriated lands, that's the word we still use in our Enabling Act today. The unappropriated lands that may be ceded or relinquished to the United States by the states shall be disposed of for the common benefit and be settled and formed into distinct republican states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as the other states, and be granted and settled under such regulations as Congress may determine. The regulations are simply for disposing of the land, right? Makes sense. And they said, on that basis, they said, okay, fine, that's good enough. On that basis, New York was the first to cede its lands to the Continental Congress. And New York said this in their deed of cession: create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever was their express language. And they ceded their land. And the others of the 7 did as well. Now, they started in 1780 with New York. Georgia didn't cede their land until 1802, well after the Constitution. Some people have said, oh, well, that's just old stuff. It doesn't matter. No, in fact, that was the trust agreement that they had created to settle their claims to these western lands. And so even in 1802, based on this document, Georgia ceded its land, said the same thing. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, and for no other use or purpose whatsoever. So we win this improbable war. And by 1784, now it's time to determine in the Articles of Confederation, as they're preparing that, how are we going to deal with these western lands? There's a temptation that the states, hey, we were just kidding about that cession thing now that we've won. You know, this was still a big issue. I mean, all these lands and resources and all the rest, but they still needed to clarify that and put that to bed. And so they wanted to find someone who could write a thing or two, and so they went to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson wrote the Land Ordinance of 1784 to now clarify under what would be the Articles of Confederation the same purposes with respect to the western lands. The states in no case shall interfere with the primary disposal of the soil by the United States, nor with the ordinances and regulations which Congress may find necessary for securing title in such soil to the bona fide purchasers. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt. And these states shall be on an equal footing with the original states. Same rights as sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Pretty consistent, right? Same stuff. So that's in 1784. Now fast forward to 1787. Now it's time to actually create new states. Now we're getting ready to create new states in the territory, which was northwest of the River Ohio. They called it the Northwest Territory or the Territory. They were contemplating others, but that was the territory. So now they're ready to create new states. They draft the Northwest Ordinance in July 13th of 1787, and look what they say. Establishment of states, admission on an equal footing with the original states. It all has to do with creating states and with the land and disposing of the land. Equal footing. And the legislatures of those states shall never interfere with the primary disposal of the soil by the United States Congress or with any regulations for securing title in the soil to bona fide purchasers. Right? Pretty consistent. So now we get, you're like, okay, you're with me on the history. We come back from 1763, we got the claims and all the stuff that's happening. We get to 1787 and what we're celebrating 225 years ago. And when they get to Article 4, Section 3, there's one page of debate on this section. Pretty important thing. There's one page of debate. You know why? Because they said, we're not opening that can of worms. We're just going to preserve the status quo. Article 4, Section 3 is simply to preserve the status quo. Well, what's the status quo? 1763, 1780, 1784, 1787. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. And so they drafted this. Now, think about this for a second. This isn't in Article 1. In Article 1 is the rights and powers of Congress. In the rights and powers of Congress, they have the power to own D.C. in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, to own D.C., and to buy other property with the consent of the legislature and only for forts, batteries, dockyards, arsenals, other needful buildings. That's the power of Congress in Article 1, Section 8. This isn't in Article 4. Article 4 is the rights of and obligations to the states. Article 1, powers of Congress. Article 2, powers of President. Article 3, powers of the court. Article 4, rights of and obligations to the states. So in the section that is the rights of and obligations to the states, Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and other property. The territory being the Northwest Territory, other property or liens and other things that they envisioned might come in to be property of the United States. They have the power to dispose of. And then down here, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Go ask a lawyer what that means. What does that mean by claims in Article 4, Section 3? Lowell's kind of chuckling, you know what claims means, right? 1763, 1780, 1784, we put this to bed. This was the great embarrassment that we solved a long time ago. We're not opening that can of worms. Now, but then think about the way this is being read today, and what you'll hear is it says, make needful rules and regulations. Well, that means Congress has the supremacy clause, and the federal government is supreme, and so make needful rules and regulations means they can do whatever they want. Think about that for a second. In Article 6, Clause 2, the supremacy clause, it says, this Constitution and the laws made pursuant thereof shall be the supreme law of the land. All of it. Not just this second subclause of Article 4, Section 3 is supreme, but all of it. But so to read needful rules and regulations supersedes everything else, you have to get out your big black magic marker and say, I'm going to scratch out the first subclause where it says the power to dispose, when that was the purpose all the way through. And I have to go over to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 that says I can only own property, certain enclaves, that I buy with permission of the legislature for certain limited purpose. I got to scratch that one out too. And I also have to go to Article 4 where it says we guarantee the property of the new states, the territory of the new states. I got to scratch that one out too. And in Article 4 where it says we guarantee a republican form of government, you get to govern all the land within your boundaries, I got to scratch that one out too. And I've got to go to Article 6, Section 1 that says all engagements, remember that term? All engagements entered into before the Constitution shall be valid and binding against the United States as they were under the Confederacy. I got to scratch that one out too. And oh, by the way, I got to scratch out the supremacy clause because we didn't really mean this whole Constitution. We only meant Article 4, Section 3, Subclause 2 is supreme. See how ridiculous that is? But that's the argument. That's the argument. So we have to understand this because that's where the power comes from. So we understand Article 4, Section 3, it's critical. So let's talk about the history, right? They knew their history, knew their rights, banded together, refused to take no for an answer. Andrew Jackson, president in 1833, drafted a veto statement of a bill that came before him. By 1833, the national debt had been paid off. How would that be? And so Henry Clay, senator from Kentucky, came up with a great idea. So we paid off the debt. It's a great national public trust to dispose of the land. We can't interfere with that. We have to dispose of the land. But since the debt is paid off, we'll take the money and we'll use it as a slush fund. And when we go to mayors and when we go to states, we'll dish the money out only if they do what we want. Sound familiar? And they passed both houses of Congress and sent that bill to President Jackson. He said, you don't understand. The compacts with respect to that land preceded the Constitution and formed the very basis upon which we ever came to a Constitution. They're solemn compacts, a sacred trust. And so Andrew Jackson, mind you, was born in 1767. So by age 20 in 1787, when they drafted Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution, he's not some 20-year-old sitting in the basement in his underpants playing video games. He's a 20-year-old lawyer in Tennessee. Tennessee is yet to be a state. He's in the public land territory, if you will. He spent his military career in Orleans and in the public land area that is yet to be states. And so by 1833, when he drafted what I believe is the most concise contemporaneous history of our public land and the great trust and duty to dispose of the land, he lived this. He wasn't reading it in a book. Now, he cites all of the documents and gives all kinds of citations, but this is who drafts this statement. This is just one small part. So your second homework assignment now, on the website, AmericanLandsCouncil.org, under the Resources tab, you'll find the Andrew Jackson veto statement. It's about 7 or 8 pages long. I've already highlighted it all for you. The only problem is I highlighted the whole thing because it's so amazing. There's a few sentences I didn't highlight. You can skip those, right? But so look at what he says. This is just one part of it. The price of these lands shall be reduced and graduated. And after they've been offered for a certain number of years, the refuse remaining unsold shall be abandoned to the United States. Or I'm sorry, shall be abandoned to the states, and the machinery of our land system entirely withdrawn. Amen. What would that look like? It cannot be supposed the compacts, going back to 1780 and then the deeds of cession, intended that the United States should forever retain a title to lands within the states which are of no value. And no doubt is entertained that the general interest would be best promoted, the general interest, the interest of Utah and the United States, would be best promoted by surrendering such lands to the states. We have to know our history. We have to know our rights. Band together, refuse to take no for an answer. In fact, this trust history was maintained for nearly 200 years. So looking up into 1930, President Hoover, so the states, Utah was made a state in 1896, Arizona in 1912, New Mexico in 1912, and others, and they said, hey, get on with your business. You're supposed to dispose of this land. We'll get around to it. Your land is just more arid and rugged. It's going to take longer. True statement. I don't think it was nefarious from the get-go. True statement. The land was more rugged. It was more arid. It was harder to dispose of. But by 1930, they said, hey, you got to keep your promise. President Hoover held a commission. And following his commission, they had congressional hearings. Look at the title of the congressional hearings. Granting remaining unreserved public lands to the states. Not if, only how. Now, their great ideas were, okay, we've heard you, fine. We're going to give you all the title to your lands. We're just going to keep all the minerals. And Howard, the governor and the Public Lands Commissioner of New Mexico, said, no, that doesn't work for us. You're not going to, in their exact language that they used, you're not going to chop up the loaf. You've got to give us the whole loaf. That's what your Public Lands Commissioner said to Congress. He said, that doesn't work for us. And so they bogged down, and of course Congress, when it delays, it wins, and they continued to delay more. And in 1934, they had the Taylor Grazing Act, and they said, okay, this is just a management act pending final disposal. And that same trust history was the understanding until 1976. In 1976, Congress said it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. With all of that Constitution and sacred trust and solemn compact history for 200 years, Congress had the audacity to say it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. Now what they did, as Congress typically does, when the outrage began to happen, and some of our good friends here were in the middle of it, they said, oh, okay, don't worry. What we'll do is we'll give you PILT payments. Payment in lieu of taxes. Remember, attribute of sovereignty is to tax the land to provide the benefits to educate the children to be a sovereign state. We'll give you payments in lieu of taxes, and we promise that you'll have local control, multiple use, and sustained yield. How's that working out?
Not too good. Hoisting the turtles off on us right now.
Yeah. No local input, virtually no use, and no control over most of the land. A promise upon a promise upon a promise broken. But that's the history. 2009, United States Supreme Court, unanimously, 2009, it's a couple years ago, United States Supreme Court in a case called Hawaii versus the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. 1893, industrial powers had overthrown the Hawaiian monarchy, took their land, gave it to the federal government. The Hawaiians were not pleased. They were not pleased for many years. And when Hawaii was made a state, they said, fine, we're going to give all the land to the state of Hawaii. Incidentally, they did that to Tennessee. They gave 13 million acres directly to Michigan. There are precedents for this. But in 1959, they made Hawaii a state, said, here's all your land. You hold some of it in trust, you dispose of it. They had this Office of Hawaiian Affairs that looked out for the Native Hawaiian interest because they were still upset with what was going on. By 1993, the Native Hawaiians were still not pleased. Senator Inoue ran an apology resolution in Congress, and the apology resolution said, whereas, now therefore, we apologize to the Native Hawaiians, and nothing in this resolution shall deny or disparage claims of the Native Hawaiians against the federal government. So you've got the act of statehood, solemn act of statehood. You've got a subsequent act of Congress that purports to erode that act of statehood, and here's what the United States Supreme Court says. The consequences of admission are instantaneous, and it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what was already bestowed. And that proposition applies with even greater force and effect where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. Congress cannot unilaterally, through a policy, change the solemn compact, the uniquely sovereign character of a state's admission. Do you see the power in that? That's this United States Supreme Court. Let's look just a little bit more. There's more legal authority that goes to that. We'll talk about some of the myths in just a minute in terms of what they throw up. But 1980 Supreme Court, enabling acts are solemn compacts, bilateral agreements to be performed in a timely fashion. By the way, this is all on the website. Federal government, some people had said, yeah, that whole compact thing, that just happened from the original states and the land cessions. It doesn't apply to treaties and later acquired land. Supreme Court, right at the time of Utah's Enabling Act, said, yeah, afraid not. Doesn't matter whether it's a treaty, whether it's cession, whether it's by purchase. Those lands are held in trust for the several states ultimately to be created. In fact, down here, about the same time that Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana are up in arms and collectivized in their effort to get the federal government to keep its promise, the Supreme Court said, once the United States has fully executed these trusts, the municipal sovereignty of the states will be complete throughout their borders, and they and the original states will be upon an equal footing. Equal footing applies to statehood and to the lands. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil except for temporary purposes to execute the trusts. Sound pretty consistent, right? So let's look to just 2 months ago. We just talked about this in the main session. The not Affordable Care Act decision, right? I mean, and think about it, right? With your kids come to you, Dad, solve my problem. You solve their problem. They keep coming back to you, Dad, solve my problem, and you do solve my problem. And then by the time they're 30 and they're asking for permission to act like an adult, and they've never grown to become an adult because they've never learned to solve their own problems, that's what this decision is. Think about Justice Roberts and 6 other members of the United States Supreme Court said, grow up. Grow up. Because if you don't, we have a one-dimensional government where every time you act, you come to us and say, hey, Mother, may I, pretty please, be a state? Mother, may I, pretty please, take care of my people? No, then you have a one-dimensional government, which is so antithetical to this unprecedented system of internal and external balances. So here's what they say. Federal government has expanded dramatically over the past 2 centuries, you think? But it still must show that a constitutional grant of power authorizes each of its actions. But the same does not apply to the states, because the Constitution is not the source of their power. State governments do not need constitutional authorization to create and operate schools, to punish crime, to zone and plan property. Our cases refer to this general power of governing possessed by the states, but not by the federal government as the police power. The power, the right, the duty, the moral obligation to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their people. The framers ensured that the powers which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties, our very ideology, were held by governments more local, more accountable than a distant federal bureaucracy. This independent power, again, not Mother May I, not pretty please, this independent power of the states serves as a check on the federal power of the federal government. By denying any one government complete jurisdiction, another key word, sheriff, right? Critical word. By denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism, our governing partnership, not a subordinate subdivision. Not you have the liberty to do what I tell you to do, but this governing partnership protects the liberty of the individual from arbitrary federal power. That's the whole point. And then here's the punchline. In the typical case, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of simply not yielding to the federal blandishments, coaxing, coercing, cajoling, of simply not yielding to the federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace the federal policies as their own. States are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. Grow up. They said, we're not opining on the merits of what Congress did. Then they turned to the people and they said, people, you gave them the 16th Amendment and you elected these guys. And if they've elected to tax you in this fashion, grow up. We're not talking about the merits of the decision, they said specifically. We're talking about the system. Because if we don't fix the system, it doesn't matter what the issues are. Grow up. That's never pleasant to hear, but we're there. So, that's a long answer to question number one. You can shorten it up, but the first question you're going to teach two people. The first why question, why did they succeed in 1828? Because it's been done before and the promises are the same. Second why question, why the difference? Why the difference? Now, I want you to be very kind to your friends when you ask them that. Those that are with you, you'll know, but those that aren't, they're going to come up with all kinds of funny answers. And it really is kind of amusing, but be kind. Why the difference? The promises are the same. On the right, you have North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, their enabling act with respect to the disposal of public land. And on the left, you have Utah. Word for word the same, except for maybe a comma or two different. Word for word the same. People inhabiting the states do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands lying within the boundaries thereof. Many people will try to put a big fat period right there. Do you see a big fat period right in the middle of that first sentence? Until title thereto shall have been extinguished by the United States, the same shall be and remain subject to the disposition of the United States. Remember what we learned in 1780 and 1784 and 1787? To dispose of. You only hold those lands to dispose of them. Same stuff. In fact, the Supreme Court has said this means the same thing. This is kind of interesting. Some people will say, well, we just ran out of constitutional gas when we got to Denver. And so therefore we keep all your land. No, I'm not kidding. I mean, it's just crazy, the stuff that comes up. But so you see the dots on the right? Those are the public land states. California was made a state in 1850, 48% federally controlled land. Oklahoma down there in 1907, virtually no public land, same promises. You look at the middle extreme, you got North and South Dakota, and then you got Montana. 1880, same exact enabling act. They used one enabling act for all four of those states. North Dakota 3%, Montana's got about 33%. Idaho was 1 year later, same promises, 63%. Utah 5 years later in the Enabling Act, 7 years later in statehood, we've got 65% public land. Why the difference? Why the difference? Why the federal fault line? Promises are the same. Why the difference? Here's what you'll hear, okay? Now again, when they say these things, you want to be kind and not laugh too badly. But here's what you'll hear. You gave up title to your lands. You didn't want the trillions in timber resources. You'd rather burn them up. You didn't want trillions in coal. You didn't want trillions in oil. You didn't want the ability to govern yourself instead of having the Bureau of Land Management and Department of Interior come in on Christmas Eve and say, hey, guess what? We're just going to take 6 million acres and tie it up off the table. You can't ever go there again. You just didn't want that. I mean, really? I'll tell you, the one really amusing one was when it says, forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands, as if there were a period, and there's not. I had someone come up to me and they said, well, you know, for Utah, it's because of that whole Mormon thing, you know, at Mormonhood, at statehood, you had to give away the farm to become a state because of that. I said, really? Where do you get that? Oh, it says forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands. I said, yeah, that's because of the Mormon issue at statehood, huh? Yeah, that's because of the Mormon issue. Really? Wow, I didn't realize that North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Missouri, I didn't realize that they had any kind of Mormon issue at statehood because that language is word for word the same in their enabling acts. And they went, oh, this was a senior staffer for a member of Congress. Oh, we'll talk later, you know. Yes, we sure will, right? But we've created these fables to maintain ourselves as a colony. Because as Martin Luther King said, the soft-minded man always fears change. To him, the greatest pain is the pain of a new idea. I won't tell you that. So, back to the, I'm sorry, we're still on the 4 myths, right? So, first of all, you gave up title to the land, right? The second one is, you can't manage your lands. Arkansas and Missouri can, but you can't manage your lands. We already manage millions of acres in the state, and again, we don't manage our forests for maximum combustion to burn up tens of millions of animals, you know. We're not $16 trillion in debt. We actually balance a budget. We actually have a budget. How novel is that?
It's too expensive. That's the popular radio commercial right now. We can't
Yeah, too expensive. Think about that. So Utah and North Dakota, same time, same promise at statehood. North Dakota gets 100% of its mineral royalty money. We get 46%. That's hundreds of millions of dollars just right there, without even looking at any other low-hanging fruit. Really? But yeah, that's the kind of stuff they come up with. Then they say these lands belong to all of us. Well, isn't that convenient? Last I checked, in Kane County that only has 5% taxable land, all of us aren't paying for schools. All of us aren't paying for roads and police and fire and sanitation. You know, when the county clerk starts sending out tax notices to Central Park East, then maybe they have an argument. But until then, and then even with that, why all of a sudden, when the promises are the same, does it arbitrarily belong to all of us right there? You know, if the promises are the same and it belongs to all of us, either you need to give yours back or you need to keep your promise to us. But that's what you hear. And the last one you'll hear is, it's clearly unconstitutional. Well, thank you, Supreme Court of One. Because the Supreme Court has said Congress cannot, by policy, change the unilateral, uniquely sovereign character of a state's admission. And what they'll say, you'll get legislative attorneys that, again, I mean, be patient with them because they've been trained in law schools where you don't study the Constitution, you study what the Supreme Court has said about the Constitution only from 1930 forward. And they just don't, it's just true. I sat in those classes. So what they'll say is, and I just got a memo on this just recently, oh, you forever disclaimed all right and title to your lands, and some of the other states have that same language, therefore you're going to be a colony forever. Well, read the rest of the sentence, why don't you? And why don't you look just to the east of your state where all the other states made that same promise? Maybe there's another explanation. But that's what you'll hear, okay? So, why the difference? And the 4 myths as to why the difference. So, you've got the first 2 questions. We're going to teach 2 people. We're also going to study at least 2 things on the resources tab, one of them being the Andrew Jackson statement. Third why question now, okay? Why does it matter? Why does it matter? We've talked about this just a little bit, but education equality. Congressman Bishop talked about this morning. North Dakota, Utah, same time, same promises. North Dakota's got 20,000 jobs just looking for people. They just put $1.2 billion into roads and school buildings. They just added $3,700 a pupil above the national average. Utah's $3,700 below the national average in per pupil funding. It would take us $2.2 billion just to get to average in Utah. It would take us another $2.2 billion just to catch up with our neighbor, and we have the same amount of resource, if not more, and we'll see that in just a second. Some people have said, well, you just need to try harder. You just need to tax yourself more. We'd have to double income tax and kill the economy. You could increase the corporate tax by 1,000% and kill the economy. Or we could simply stand up and access our resources in a responsible way. This is what Congressman Bishop was pointing out. Interesting, the similarity, the states that have the hardest time funding education and our red map. This is the video. It's on the website. We won't go into that, but that's Congressman Bishop. You heard from him earlier. Does such an effective job teaching on this, but we don't have access to property tax, to income tax, severance tax, royalty payments, the economic multiplier effect from deciding how we're going to access our lands. That's just low-hanging fruit. Even our state trust lands, the lands we already have, school trust lands, they're checkerboarded. We can't even get to them. We're losing hundreds of millions of dollars just because we can't access the lands we already have. So, education equality, economic self-reliance. This is what every state looks like. 30 to 50% of our state budgets come from a federal government committing fiscal suicide. Kevin talked about that brilliantly, and we'll hear more from him later on that. But this is the budget whole. Now, I want you to look at this. This is Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson. Right after the 2008 meltdown, President Obama said, you know, we don't want to do the hard things. Let's have a commission, and we'll punt to a commission. They get Erskine Bowles, Clinton White House Chief of Staff, Alan Simpson, former senator from Wyoming, to be the co-chairs of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission. They study what happened for more than a year and what's coming for more than a year, and they reported to Congress almost 18 months ago. 18 months ago, and listen to what they said.
What I tell people is very simple, and people in America are way ahead of all of you. They know what's going on, because when you say, why don't you go back and think of what people are doing at their kitchen table? I'll tell you what they're doing at their kitchen table. They know that if you spend more than you earn, you lose your butt. And they know that if you spend $1 and borrow 40 cents of it, you must be stupid. And they've got it figured out that this government is stupid. To borrow 40 cents for every buck you spend, forget the charts, forget the GDP, all the rest of it. That's where we are.
I think we face the most predictable economic crisis in history. A lot of us sitting in this room didn't see this last crisis as it came upon us, but this one is really easy to see. The fiscal path we are on today is simply not sustainable. This debt and these deficits that we are incurring on an annual basis are like a cancer, and they are truly going to destroy this country from within unless we have the common sense to do something about it.
I appreciate that both he and Mr. Bowles were willing to take on this task, and I appreciate the results that they've gotten and the way that they've promoted it across the country. It needed to be done. I was one of the co-sponsors of the Conrad Gregg bill and thought that that was essential, and was disappointed when that didn't pass, and was elated when the President decided to do it anyway, and thought that was a good step. I got to say, I was a little disappointed when the President missed the opportunity in the State of the Union speech to say exactly what you've been saying here today, to inform the people of this country of just how desperate the situation is, so that we could take some positive action on it. And I was disappointed when the budget proposal came out, because I think that was another opportunity for him to show exactly what you had been saying and to put some of those things into effect. And the biggest thing he did in there was take the tax expenditures and use them for new programs instead of reducing the corporate debt. The American people have figured it out with your help, and they're getting it clearer and clearer every day. We've got to get Congress to catch up.
Let me just tell you how crazy our situation is today. We have this treaty where we're supposed, if China were to attack Taiwan, we're supposed to support Taiwan. The only problem is we'd have to borrow the money from China in order to do it. You know, this is a real mess we're in today. And we can either take the ostrich theory and put our heads in the sand, or we can decide we're going to step up and do something about it. But I can tell you, bankers aren't going to continue to finance something that they aren't sure they're going to get paid back. And the less sure they are, the more they're going to charge you at first, and then they're going to cut you off. And we're borrowing half of our money from foreign countries.
So we could talk about that clip, that 2-minute clip, for a week. Oh, we're done already?
Yep.
Oh my gosh. Okay, we got to go quickly. That it is on the website. The $16 trillion debt, $5 trillion in unfunded obligations. We've got the resource if we've got the will. We've got more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming than the rest of the world combined, according to the government auditors just 2 months ago. There's the video for that. But it's not just education, equality, economic self-reliance. It's environmental quality. Look at the map. This map and wildfires greater than 250 acres. We're loving our forest to death. By government-owned documents, we're loving our forest to death, doubling the acreage of wildfires, doubling the intensity, doubling the cost. Like they talk, we've got 900 trees per acre. The historical average is 40. We're turning them into saran wrap and washing everything, as you heard from Mia Love, washing it down. Yes?
And not to mention that Al-Qaeda wants to set wildfires as an act of economic war.
We've given them the fuel. It's right there, right? It's right there. By their own documents, but wildlife preservation as well. We're killing tens and hundreds of millions of animals in the process. Let's go through some of this. So the last why, all right? So you've got the 3 whys so far. Why did they succeed already? Why the difference? Why does it matter? Why don't we do something about it? So in Utah, as the Supreme Court said, to act like it, and in a partnership, you can either allow things to keep languishing on or you set a deadline and say, we're going to work with you as our partner, but we're going to work toward a deadline. We're not going to allow this to delay forever. So in Utah, in House Bill 148, we set a deadline. December 31st, 2014, we want nothing more than to work with you as our governing partner, not subordinate subdivision, not dependent, but as a partner. And we want to work towards an orderly transfer of these lands directly to the state to be managed by Utahns, and for our guests from around the world. Now, national parks off the table. National monuments, with the exception of Escalante, where $2 trillion of coal was tied up by President Clinton without talking to a single Utahn, that's still in play. Congressionally designated wilderness, off the table. We already tie up an area approximately the size of West Virginia to maintain it as open space, right? So those that tell you we want to strip mine everything, no, of course not. This is by Utahns, for Utahns. Grazing, that's who we are. Recreation, that's who we are. Open space, access, mining, that's who we all are. So we take all of those rights, preserve them status quo by transferring the land to the state to be managed like they promised in FLIPMA. Remember, local input, multiple use, sustained yield. All of the planning that's happening right now in how we put this into place, measuring twice, cutting once, is happening from the county level up. In fact, on the 27th, we got a meeting down in Richfield, county commissioners, to begin working on the actual detail on-the-ground plan of how we begin to implement what we're doing here. In the bill, we indemnify, hold harmless our counties from the PILT and the other things that economically are going away soon anyway. But we hold harmless that situation. If we sell any land, we don't envision that, but in the Utah Public Lands Commission to be formed, if we sell any land through a public process, 5% goes to the Permanent Education Fund, 95% goes to the federal government to pay the debt. That's our deal. I don't like it. I'd want to pay them nothing. But that's our deal, and we're going to honor our deal. So, 3 asks, okay? Actually, I've got 4. It's a 2x4. If I had one, I'd smack you with it and you'd never forget it. But I don't. But you'll remember it this way. We're going to teach 2 people. You've got your card, you've got your teaching aid. We're going to teach 2 people. You're going to go to the resources tab on the AmericanLandsCouncil.org site. You're going to study at least 2 things, one of them being the Andrew Jackson statement. You need to engage your jurisdictional giants. Hot Rod Hundley, right? When he played with Wilt Chamberlain, he says, Wilt and I combined one night to score 52 points and win the game. And you ask him, say, Rod, how many points did you score? He says, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't, but if you push him, he says, I scored 2 points. But they won the game. We have jurisdictional giants like sheriffs and county commissioners and state representatives and governors that need to be engaged and encouraged. The other team's going to boo like crazy. And when they do, we got to cheer all the louder. And we got to keep scoring our 2 points and feed them the ball. And keep feeding them the ball. That's our system. That's how we collectivize our power. 10 of you can pick a new state representative. 10 of you can have an influence on who your county commissioners are. 10 of you can get with others and have a real substantial impact on who your governor is. That's the beauty of our system. That's the control that we have. It doesn't take many to then collectivize our power in a Republican form of government. But we have to engage and encourage these jurisdictional giants. So your 3rd assignment is engage at least 2. Call the governor, thank him for standing up for Utah's children and Utah's future. Call your representative, your commissioners, and say, stand up and act like it. Then the 4th one, okay, the last one that we've got is, what's the last one, Vicki? God, I just drew a blank, man. Can you believe that? It'll come to me. There's a 4th one. Oh, I know what it is. Facebook. It's the easiest way to communicate. How many are on Facebook? Okay, I'm going to expect at least 20 new friends on Facebook. Go to the Facebook page, like the American Lands Council Facebook page. By the way, Rob Bishop's speech this morning, he gave a similar speech at the American Legislative Exchange Council, only he had more time. It's brilliant. It's posted on there this morning. But go to the Facebook page and get at least 2 others to like the page. So there's your 2x4. Teach 2 people. Study 2 things. Engage and encourage 2 jurisdictional giants. Like the Facebook page and get 2 others. Here's a 60-second video you can share with others. In your states, we can have this made to reflect your state. It is now our turn to write the history of this moment. It's a wonderful time to be alive. It's so fascinating. We get to write the history of this moment. What will it look like? It's our responsibility to do that. Ronald Reagan in 1985, at the height of the Cold War, nuclear proliferation, they thought bombs were going to fly at any moment, the red phone. And Ronald Reagan made this statement that is more appropriate for us today. This is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness, and these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors, out to seize back a country and a world to freedom. Thank you very much.